Thank you. So I want to talk about from food banks to organ banks. And these are all computational problems. They're what do we call fair division problems. They're about dividing up scarce resources. And there are increasing pressures on us to be able to do this well, efficiently. Environmental pressures, economic pressures. And what's interesting, of course, is the technological opportunities that the fact that we've got smartphones and everything's connected and we can build new markets on the internet and so on that allow us to do, as you'll see in the talk, some interesting things. So the first thing is food banks. Let's start with food banks. Here we're working with an interesting company. They call themselves a social startup. They're a bunch of students that came out of my university. They set up a company called Food Bank Local, whose goal is not to make money for them, but actually to improve the world. And they've been working very closely with Food Bank Australia, probably the main charity that helps distribute food to charities like the Salvation Army that feed the poor. And what we've been doing, unfortunately, feeding people using food banks is, even in a first world country like Australia, is an increasing problem. The population of Australia is about 23 million people today. And there's over 100,000 people homeless. They're some of the most people using food banks, but also there's nearly 10% of the population is in poverty. That's the technical definition of poverty, having less than 50% of the median income. But these are people who struggle to pay both the rent and to be able to afford to eat. And of course, the first thing you give up is you pay the rent, but you don't actually have any money left to put any food on the table, especially for your children. And sadly, these charities are seeing increasing demand for their services. Food Bank Australia are seeing over a 10% increase annually for people coming to the food to come and seek food from the various charities. So they're wanting to do more with the limited number of resources that they have, the food that's donated from supermarkets and catering companies and various other people. And so we've been working with Food Bank Local to help them develop an app that can actually reduce the friction, improve the efficiency with which food that's donated is shared amongst, this is the fair division problem, is shared amongst the different charities, the Salvation Army and the other charities that feed people. And as this title of this slide suggests, this app also solves another problem, which they were solving by a piece of paper beforehand, which is the vehicle routing problem, which is they've only got a small number of trucks and they've got to drive round during the course of the day and get the food to the different charities. And of course they want to limit the amount of distance they travel, maximize the service that they can provide. So behind the scenes, we're solving this fair division problem, which induces a vehicle routing problem, which we're also helping them solve as well with our vehicle routing solver. So that's a very nice example of how we can use technology. And some of the, I should say, I mean, some of the technology is just simple stuff. Before, you would just give the driver, volunteer, a list of places he had to go, and he or she would have to work out where to drive. Now we can also, not only do we solve the routing problem, the traveling salesman problem for them, we also give them turn-by-turn directions. And that's the bit they actually love best, because they now don't have to think about what to do, but we're actually also improving the efficiency with which they do it by solving a traveling salesman problem behind the scenes. Okay, now move on to the second problem, organ banks. So the technical challenge here is that fewer 18-year-old people are dying on the roads of Australia and donating their organs. In 1989, the first year that we have data was collected, the average age of a donated organ, mostly from road traffic accidents, people on motorbikes and the like, was 32.4 years. Lots of 18-year-olds were lowering the average age down to 32.4 years. In 2014, the last year that we have the data for at the moment, the mean age was 46. There's been a significant increase in the age of organs that are being donated and being transplanted into people on the waiting list. And that's a real problem. The surgeons are getting increasingly worried about where this is going and how they can actually improve the life expectancy of their patients. So I was lucky enough to be introduced to the Organ and Tissue Authority, the body that does most of the matching of organs to patients in Australia, and now in Australia and New Zealand, because there's an exchange program across the Tasman Sea. And luckily enough for us, they're just at the moment they're thinking about upgrading their software, and they want to improve the matching. In particular, they want to match the age of the organ. They measure the age with this thing called the kidney donor patient index. But essentially, it really measures just how old the organ is with the age of the patient. And again, they have a special term, the expected post-transplant survival index, EPTS. But again, this is essentially a number between 1 and 100 that measures, largely speaking, the age of the patient. So at the moment, what happens? Well, once you've found a compatible blood and tissue type, they completely ignore the age of the patient and the age of the organ. And so this is a scatter plot. On the x-axis, you've got the age, essentially the age of the organ, and the y-axis, the age of the patient. Oh, no, the other way around. But anyway, it doesn't matter. There's no correlation because they ignore it in doing the matching. And this is bad from a medical perspective. They will have old patients dying as they will, naturally, and they'll have a young organ inside them. That was a terrible waste from the surgeon's perspective of a young organ that could have provided more life for someone else. They'll also have young patients who will be transplanted to old organs. After 10 years, those organs will fail. That's a terrible problem now because, well, first of all, you need another organ for that person. And secondly, that person now is sensitized. Their immune system is highly sensitized. You have to find a much better quality match. So that's a very poor outcome for that patient as well. And a third problem is that there's a lot of strategizing within the system, that surgeons will be offered organs and they'll turn them down, say, no, I'm going to wait for my patient to have a better quality organ. And so they'll say that, they get a call at 8 o'clock in the morning, offered an organ, and they'll turn it down because it's too old for their patient. And at midday, they'll be phoned up again and told, would you like this organ for some other one of your patient? And so they've been ringing around the country trying to find someone to match this organ to some patient. And the organ has to be transplanted that day. It's been sitting on ice. They'd like to have a system where there's no advantage to turning down the organ being offered to you. You're only making your patient wait longer on the waiting list. That there'll be a consistency to the quality of the organs. So we're proposing a mechanism for them to improve this. This actually, when I got introduced to them, this was the mechanism that they had. They were proposing to use. And the first thing I did was to show them using some simulated data that would improve the matching only very slightly. This is a little bit better than the random cloud that you saw before, but not much better. And so now I'm persuading them with a new mechanism, which is a very simple mechanism, which is you find the compatible blood tissue types, and then you find the matches that minimize the distance between the age of the patient, essentially, and the age of the organ, and you break ties by time on the waiting list. Very simple mechanism, but surprisingly, they hadn't thought of using this themselves. But you can see there's a lovely correlation now between the age of the patient and the age of the organ, which is, from a medical perspective, exactly what they'd like to achieve. And we've been trying to study this using some of the tools we have from computational tools and economic tools that we have. So we've set this up as if you could go to the end of the year, you could give them a perfect match. You could say, these are all the organs that are going to be donated through the course of this year, and these are all the patients we've got sitting on the waiting list. A very simple algorithmic problem to come up with a perfect matching. Unfortunately, we don't have the benefit to do that because we have to do this in an online fashion. You have to these are patients who donated the organs because they've died. You've got to transplant that organ within the next 24 hours. So we set this up as an online problem. We have at any moment an organ arrives as matched to a compatible patient, or a new patient arrives, people are added to the waiting list, or patients depart. Unfortunately, patients die, patients go off and have organs transplanted elsewhere in other countries. And there's various performance measures that we're interested in, like the utility, the difference between the age of the organ and the age of the patient, also other things like the waiting time. And then we've been studying this just to give you a flavor for the sorts of things that we can help them with, thinking about, well, what axiomatic properties can we achieve? Like Pareto efficiency, we want to come up with a matching where we can't make someone better off without making someone else worse. Anonymity, we want to treat two patients with equal age equally. Neutrality, if we rotate the arrival order of the organs, it's the same. There's various monotonicity properties. If we add more organs to the problem, life should only get better for the patients on the waiting list. If we add patients to the waiting list, their lives shouldn't get better. There's only more competition for organs. So some simple sorts of properties that you can start asking about this online problem. So we ask things like liveliness. If you get on the waiting list, we'd like a mechanism where eventually you'll be matched. This is the one the surgeons like. Participation. You can't game the system if you're. You shouldn't reject an offered organ. And then game theoretic ideas like strategy proofness. You can't increase your utility by behaving insincerely. And then finally, again, it's an online problem. We can think of it in another computational idea, the competitive ratio. What's the quality of the matching compared to what we could do post hoc if we had perfect information, which of course we don't. Anyway, just to conclude, it's a lovely problem to work on. It's interesting from a theoretical academic perspective because it has properties like this online nature of it that people haven't really thought about when they've been thinking about fair division in the literature. Nevertheless, we can take on board much of the theoretical work, the academic work in terms of fair division as a starting point for devising these new mechanisms and a starting point for studying the properties of the mechanisms so that we can persuade them that this is the sorts of things that they should be implementing and improve the quality of lives of the patients on the waiting list who are being matched with their organs. Thank you very much.
Is there any, what mechanism are you using that satisfies all those properties?
Those properties are almost surely impossible. One of the things we're working on is proving you cannot have all those properties together, right? Things like, it's almost surely impossible there's some simple impossibility results. So what we're helping them do is explore the trade-off space between if you want this property, you may have to give up this property. And so they're going to have to make a decision as to what they want.